Thank you very much. I have a whole bunch of slides, but I'm not sure I'm going to use them. I'm all standing between you and Chen Long's concluding remarks, so I'll try to keep it brief. You've heard a lot of very interesting and insightful comments that I actually agree with, and there's no point in repeating them. Chong-En said there's important issues that we need to do to reconstruct a practical, fit-for-purpose post-pandemic, global economy, and it's not going to look anything like the one we had before and for much of the post-war period. It's just not going to work. Doesn't take into account national security considerations, doesn't take into account climate change and other major externalities, and all that kind of thing. I think you all know I wrote a book with Mohamed Al-Arian, so what comes out of that is it was written before, coming out of the pandemic, but before the Trump, and it basically says there's three powerful sets of forces that are operating on the global economy and changing it. And one is a set of shocks that are now from multiple sources, pandemics, wars, climate shocks, etc., that are causing both the global private sector, the business sector, and the global policy sector to take actions that cause diversification. And it is to some extent expensive. I mean, the old system based almost everything on efficiency and comparative advantage. It was a kind of cost minimizing structure. It wasn't particularly resilient, but if you don't try to minimize costs, you won't. It's that simple. And so we emerge with lots of, new characteristics. Those shocks include geopolitical tensions, and those are not new either. They've been building over time, and you can't get rid of them. They're based on trust, security, etc. And so I don't think it's practical. Having said that, global trade has not collapsed. And one way to see what's going on now is that Trump is the latest in a sequence of shocks that are being delivered to the global economy. So I'd like to devote a few of my remarks to that. Trump was elected in November and took office in January. 2 days before he took office, he showed up, if I can find the slide, in Davos. That was him. And he gave a talk on video. It was remarkably frank about where he intended to go, but the reception of it was entirely not only positive, almost ecstatic. And the reason for that is that there is an agenda here that includes radical deregulation, some of which is probably going to have positive effects, and some other things, financial markets. The anticipation was that almost completely closed exit markets and IPO markets were going to open up. They're now slammed shut, by the way. And they just didn't see the flip side of the Trump agenda, which was which I guess in crude terms, protectionist. So now I'm going to spend a little time on kind of what that means. So I'm going to start with just a brief comment on what I must have given 45 talks to various groups of people, companies, who are just plain confused and want to know, not if you can predict what's going to happen, because nobody thinks that, but if there's a few ideas that help you think about what the scenarios and paths forward might be. And one of them is that the Trump administration and the president himself believes that the growth patterns, at least in the United States, were deficient in distributional terms. And those are the people who are a subset of the people who elected him. And what that really means is that a combination of a very open version of globalization and a whole lot of technology impacts, not including AI, had the effect of producing job and income polarization in the developed countries. It's a well-documented thing. And so it's not unreasonable to think that at some point the United States is going to elect a president who said, We've known about this for a long time, but we didn't do anything about it. Maybe it's time to do something about it. That's about as far as I can get in explaining, what the origin of this is. The second thing they believe is much more problematic, which is that any bilateral trade deficit is evidence that the United States is being treated unfairly. Now, many of you have taken a course in international economics, and so you're probably inclined to say that's rubbish and leave for the cocktail hour. But it does vaguely, somewhere in the background, sort of relate to distributional outcomes depending on who you're running deficits with. And so it is literally, in economic terms, indefensible as a proposition, but it is slightly related to the distributional agenda. The third thing is they just shocked the world, not initially with the Liberation Day tariffs, but with the announced tariffs against the first 4 or 5 or 6. So I'm going to tell you what American trade deficits look like. Okay. The two biggest, and they're almost tied, are China and the European Union. Next comes Mexico. And then we have Japan, Vietnam, and Canada. And so if you think back, 4 of those 6 were the recipients of the first round of pretty aggressive tariff announcements, 3 of which are viewed as neighbors, allies, and friendly trading partners. So people said, no, what's going on, right? I mean, I don't think anybody would have been shocked if the Trump administration continued the previous pattern of aggressive restrictions vis-a-vis China, because that strategic competition was already underway. I'm not trying to defend those policies. I'm just saying there's no continuity in that. But this other thing, it just came right out of the blue. But if you look at the bilateral deficits, it makes a little more sense, right? And then you can flounder around and look at, tariff levels and protection levels. And probably you could justify a tariff increase on American products vis-a-vis other parts of the world of 5 to 10%. Then we got the Liberation Day tariffs, and they lasted 2 days. And you may wonder why they all of a sudden produced a 90-day pause. And the answer to that is the bond markets threw up. The United States Treasury market, which is by far the largest bond market in the world, almost became illiquid, which would, if left unattended, produce catastrophic domino effects in the global financial system. And it scared them, frankly. And the people inside the financial system and in government know this. So they thought maybe we better back off and go on with this negotiation process. And so that's where we are now. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty associated with that. There's clear evidence of slowing down in the global economy. Consumer confidence has become volatile and declined. Business confidence and CapEx expenditures have declined. And so the only other thing I'm going to say about this kind of short-run stuff is you need some parameters around this if you want to understand quantitative impacts. You can't just do it in the abstract. So the United States is about 25% of the global economy without purchasing power parity adjustments. Europe used to be about the same. It's now about 2/3 of that. China is enormous, and the other really large economy. India prospectively is. But if you think of this in terms of tariffs or trade barriers, the United States, from a domestic market point of view, or a domestic supplier of those markets, whether they're a foreign or a domestic firm, faces tariffs on all products from every country in the world of varying magnitude and uncertain trajectory over time. The other 75% of the world is going to go on trading with itself and investing in each other. And so a kind of disappearing act by 25% is a pretty big shock, but it's not fatal, right? And we can overdo this. And second corollary of that is it's extremely likely, with a couple of exceptions, that the largest amounts of damage done by this will be actually in the American economy. And there are estimates of this from the IMF, 1% loss of growth. These are pretty crude because we don't know. 1% loss of growth in the United States, 0.6 in Europe, less, similar in China maybe, partly because there's an aggregate demand problem here, so it comes at the wrong time, and smaller in other parts of the world. Now, if this had happened 40 years ago, when the developed economies were dominant, I wouldn't be up here singing this tune for you. This would have been a completely different story, because we would be closing off a much larger fraction of the kind of global marketplace than is in fact occurring now. There are long-term consequences of this that tend to be, they're being thought about for sure, but they tend to get displaced or crowded out by the kind of short-term chaos. Among these are, one, political and policy leaders around the world have concluded, for better or worse, that the United States is an unpredictable and unreliable ally, and friend and trading partner. And that means they're going to take action that moves them away from dependence on the United States. Some of that will be expensive and slow them down. This is not new. I mean, Europe, where I live, is diversifying away from, at pretty high speed, from dependence on Russian fossil fuels. It's pretty expensive. It's an inflationary force in the world. But it's not the wrong thing to do. It's just, that's another example. It happens not to involve the United States. But a world in which you have less trust, underpinning your relationships, whether they're multilateral or bilateral, is a world that's going to have to be constructed with a whole lot more attention to resilience and security than the world we lived in before. And I'm not smart enough to figure out what that's going to look like in detail, but it's pretty clearly not going to look like what we had before. A second consequence of what is going on that kind of pertains to longer-term growth is that there is this isn't really globalization except indirectly, but an important dimension of globalization is the two flows associated with technology and science and people, and not just trade in goods and services and investment. And the United States is taking steps that look like it's moving it in the direction of isolation. We have made it very difficult for foreign students for the first time to come to the United States. We have been, because of quite large funding of basic science and applied science and engineering in the non-proprietary part, meaning the part that sits above, the entrepreneurial, private sector R&D structures. And they're both important. I'm not picking on one or the other. But much of that is done, it's about $96 billion a year. And much of it is done through universities, not all. There are government labs. NIH does a lot of it internally in the biomedical and life sciences. And they are in the process of threatening to remove large chunks of that funding from the university system because they don't like the universities for reasons you probably have read about. It's the home of DEI, it's the home of left-leaning people. They don't respect us. They're the elites that run the place, and they didn't do a very good job. I mean, whatever. Now, that mean, almost anybody would say that batch of investment on a continuous basis over time has been an important pillar of, whatever the faults of the United States are. Probably you wouldn't accuse the economy of lacking dynamism and advanced movement in science and technology. And so, there's an interesting set of consequences of that. You are getting lots of returnees in China. We're getting CVs in Europe in more than a trickle. Some of these are returnees, people who were drawn by the magnet of the opportunity in the United States, but would really rather live in Germany or France or Italy. And if the magnet is less attractive, as a force, then, and Europe ups its game in terms of funding. So that's another dimension of this. And so my bottom line conclusion, and the last set of things I'll say, relate to some of the things you've heard in this session already, and that is, what's the world going to look like if the United States semi-withdraws? And so the other key feature of the way this administration, and if, Trump has a successor, I don't expect them to be different, so that's an element of uncertainty. Another key feature of the way they think of the world is they intensely dislike things that are multilateral. And that doesn't mean that they want to isolate the United States. I had a confusion in talking with the people at the DRC. They thought somebody who doesn't like multilateral doesn't want to trade. That's not true. Trump, wants to trade and make deals and bilateral deals, and he's a deal maker. But what they don't like is rules and structures and organizations that kind of preside over this in the day-to-day sense. And they're important for all the reasons you know. So the United States looks like, at least for a period of time, it will be a non-participant in precisely the process that a number of the speakers spoke about, which is the need to reconstruct a version of a multilateral order that's practical, realistic, recognizes the realities of the relationships we have with each other. And that's either going to happen or it's not. So I think I'll close by saying I think there's three scenarios. One is a complete collapse, essentially what an economist would call a non-cooperative game, equilibrium. Essentially nobody takes responsibility for this. That's a really bad outcome with costs that spread all over the world, for the obvious reason that there's benefits. It would be a catastrophic outcome for the low-income countries that are struggling with growth and have no fiscal resources left after the pandemic. But it would be a pretty bad outcome for everybody. The smaller the economy, regardless of its income level, the worse it would be, right? Because small economies, this is Adam Smith, I apologize to all of you who are economists, but small economies have to specialize or they're just plain inefficient. So the beneficiaries from that would probably be the big economies like the United States and China, but that's not a great outcome. Second scenario is a new Cold War, where basically the standoff between China and the United States is sufficiently bad that they somehow manage to force, using levers that are economic, financial, and security and defense related, force people to choose. The reason I don't think that's going to happen is that there's a very large number of in the aggregate and individually big and powerful emerging economies, and as far as ex-China, that have no interest whatsoever in that scenario, and I think are going to be successful in resisting it. And it also has enormously negative outcomes. So you take the ASEAN countries, they have important relationships with China, Japan, other major advanced and very high income economies here. They probably want to maintain their relationships with us. They have economic interests that are imperfectly aligned with their security arrangements for historical reasons. That'll make life complicated. But I still think that's not where we'll go. And the third reason why I think there's a third scenario that's difficult to implement is the most likely, which is, as far as I can tell, with the exception of the United States, every part of the world remains committed to some version of having multilateral structures to facilitate the right kind of interdependence. That includes China and Europe, for sure, even though we have our differences. I think it includes all the major, emerging economies that I've interacted with and been part of. So for what it's worth, my prediction is we'll have a complicated and very difficult process of building a multilateral structure that's pragmatic. The major sponsors, I think, will be China and Europe, and hopefully at some point the United States will be allowed to rejoin. That may be a bit optimistic, but the other options are so bad that I guess my propensity to optimism leads me to think that that's the most likely outcome. Anyway, that's all from me. Thank you.